Hello, and welcome to the 20th episode of the Extreme Sports Performance Podcast. My name's Ryan Blake. I'm the founder and CEO of Extreme Sports Performance. In this episode, I'm speaking to Chris Chapman. Chris is the Director of Sports Science at Push. He's also a strength and conditioning coach with Freestyle Ski Canada and Paddle Monster. I'm going to be asking him the questions I ask all my guests: who he is, what he does, where has he come from, and what has he done along the way? What are the key moments from his career so far? What are his top areas of interest? What are the most valuable things he's learnt? Who are his top influencers? What are his top resources for information? What are his top sports performance exercises and or drills? What are his top pieces of advice in life, exercise and or sport? And finally, where can people find him? We freestyle a lot in between questions and towards the end like normal. Great to get Chris on to record this one. Hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Hi Chris, welcome to the Extreme Sports Performance Podcast. Please can you just start by introducing yourself and what you do?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. Always take any opportunity. I love talking shop. So I guess I'm a strength coach by trade. It's what I've done and what I've spent most of my time doing. I'm a director of sports science at a Canadian sport technology company called Push, and we build solutions for coaches and athletes, primarily based around the weight room, but measuring movement in general. And I'm a strength conditioning coach with Freestyle Ski Canada, primarily the slopestyle and big air discipline. And then I work as part of a company, a conglomerate of coaches called Paddle Monster. And we coach and remote coach stand-up paddlers, surf ski kayakers, outrigger canoe athletes. We're getting into watermen and other wind and wave sports. And we do that remotely worldwide. So that's kind of what I spend most of my time doing these days. A little bit of education, taught at the University of Toronto, and I do a lot of speaking and presenting.
Awesome. So could you just give us a brief history of where you kind of started out and what's led you all the way to today?
For sure. I'll try to make it short, the Coles Notes version, because I can get off tangents here. But
no worries.
I love sport growing up. And like most kids, I had a dream of being a professional something, playing sport for a living. But I was a jack of all trades, master of none. So I did too many sports and I didn't really specialize in any of them. Maybe save for martial arts because my father was a karate instructor. So I knew pretty early that I wasn't going to go anywhere in sport, but I wanted a career in it. And kinesiology, which is what exercise science is called over here in Canada, seemed like a good academic pursuit. Basically adult gym class mixed with hardcore science, which I love both. And during that path, I'd say I went down more the athletic therapy, exercise physiology route. But I had to work for my athleticism, so I always found myself spending time in the gym, and I just loved everything about the gym. Became a personal trainer, started helping to pay the bills, coaching one-on-one. Did that for a lot of years and knew that, the demographic wasn't quite where I wanted to be. I wanted to work with athletes. And an opportunity came with my first mentor, Steve Lidstone. So the university I was at, in Canada, the strength conditioning industry was pretty desolate, especially at the university level. And so the school I was at, McMaster, which is known for more physiology, was hiring a full-time strength coach and creating a whole new program. And, my dumbass at the time applied for the job and thought, oh, this job's going to be mine. I had all this experience, which I had none. The young ego at the time. But obviously I didn't get the job, but they hired Steve Lidstone. And so when he got hired, I went to go see what he had to say. And it was from that moment on and heard his story and how he got to where he was. I was all in. Like, this is what I wanted. I want this guy's job. I'm going to stick to you like glue and be a cockroach on your side and learn everything I can from you because you have the job I want. And that's kind of what sent me down that path. I dropped the athletic therapy side. I definitely ramped down the physiology side. Learning my lessons of jack of all trades, master of none, I decided, no, S&C, this is it. From there, I spent a few years as an assistant at the university. Time to fly the coop. I moved from Hamilton to Toronto, Toronto being the big city in Ontario, Canada. A lot more opportunity. And I knew I wanted to work with Olympic athletes. So Steve had brought me into the Hockey Canada circles, ice hockey, which is a bit of a rite of passage in our country. I'm probably one of the few kids that grew up not playing hockey in Canada. But being an S&C in that world, you learn a lot about the premier program that our country has to offer. And it was a great growth experience. And then he was the strength coach and therapist for Trampoline Canada, so an acrobatic discipline of gymnastics. And they were based out of Toronto, and he didn't have time to train them anymore. So when I flew the coop, he passed them on to me because I was his main protege, the person he trusted, and it was a perfect fit. So that's kind of what got me started down the action, acrobatic, extreme sports path. At the same time, I got a job working at a sports high school as a strength coach, which is something that still is very non-existent here. So that was a super cool opportunity for me to learn how to coach and teach. I think everyone should work with young demographics because it really helps you hone in your skill and get rid of the minutia and the terminology and boil things down to simple understanding and teaching skill acquisition. But my ultimate goal was still to work in Olympic sport. So there was a gentleman who was running the Sport Institute lab. His name was Chris Chapman. And I had kind of pegged him to be my next mentor. So I basically did the same thing, start knocking on his door, bugging him as much as I can. Do you need volunteers, this and that? And long story short, that ended up blossoming into a decade-long career training Olympians at the Canadian Sport Institute, which is where I've spent the majority of my professional career training various Olympic sports. Trampoline turned into, they gave me figure skating, which was another aesthetic judged acrobatic sport, which then turned into canoe kayak, mountain biking and cycling, and all these other sports that they threw at me. The next phase, I'd say after the Rio Olympics, after nearly 10 years, I was burnt out. The system was not ideal. A lot of the Olympic sports systems are going through interesting changes, and that's probably a story for another day, but I had this really unique opportunity to join Push, a tech company in my backyard. I was a pretty early adopter of velocity-based training tech, having MyoTest back in the day and first iterations of GymAware with the Palm Pilot and the original Tendo. So they were always coming to me for pretty early advice, and I joined as an advisor, and then after Rio, I joined full-time. And being on the private side, especially being in a tech company, has been a completely different, fascinating learning experience. And that kind of brings me to where I am today, dabbling in building tech, coaching, and teaching, primarily at the university college level.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that. That's a really interesting insight. And always like to ask guests that, just so listeners know what their history is and what their story is really, because everyone's got one, but they're always very different. And what would you say your ratio of Canadian Institute of Sport, Push, and all the other things you do is? It like annually? Is it possible to split those up, or is it all a bit of a mishmash depending on certain criteria?
Yeah, I mean, Push is the main driver these days. I coach 2 days a week, and then I'll travel for camps. But the beauty of my Push work is a lot of it can be done remote. A lot of it is computer-based work with engineers and developers, or getting on the horn with various clients or other researchers. I manage our research portfolio. I'd say the only times that I can't do it remotely as if I'm in the lab actually doing validation and science. Part of my job is to make sure the tech is doing what it says it does.
Sure.
But other than that, I can be pretty remote. And then teaching last year was 2 days a week, 2 half days. And that was at the university. So it all kind of I'm very fortunate that Push is very flexible. And this is kind of tech startup culture. It's not about the time you're in the office or the presenteeism. It's about, can you just get your work done? It's a very, for lack of a better term, new school millennial tech ideology. And one thing, engineers are super efficient. Like we use 7 apps to do the department of an HR. So just what technology can do to make things automated and efficient is pretty amazing. In today's connected world, I don't think presenteeism is mandatory in most jobs, aside from those that, like coaching, where you're interacting with humans on a daily basis.
And do you think, Chris, the mixed or the varied day-to-day things that you do has made you look at things from a different perspective that you might not have done, having like a multifaceted role rather than just one role?
100%. I really enjoy it. That's why I do it. I think it's like when I was at the Sport Institute. I started with one team. I worked up to 6 or 7, and then pared it back down to 2, maybe 3. You need something to get your head out of that one thing that you're focusing on all the time, and it gives you a change of focus, a change of thought, and then when you come back with a fresh mind. But there is also a limit, and I say this all the time, task saturation or attentional diffusion.
Sure. Where
you just have too many different things to focus on.
Yeah.
I'd say in my aspect, teaching is awesome because it keeps you connected with the youth and with the next generation. You get a pulse as to where everything is going, and you get to help mold and shape the people you would like to see in our industry or in society. Coaching's my passion. That's what I love. I could be in the gym all day, every day. So I always want to stay coaching. And the beauty of those two things in relation to building tech for coaches and athletes, if I'm not a current practitioner or educator, then I'm not relevant and I'm not actually using the things that I'm trying to build. So they kind of all feed off each other, is that I get to actively experiment with the tech I'm building. And because I'm still coaching and teaching, I know the use cases and I know the pain points, so I can help solve those on a regular basis. So they kind of all do go hand in hand, for lack of a better term.
I've found the same. I mean, so as you know, we spoke previously. Like I had worked 4 years in an academy setting, and worked 4 years in a pro sports setting, and now I'm probably my 3rd year into an education setting. And the level of athlete has ranged from world class all the way to complete beginner. And I find that just those different experiences have really shaped my view on how to communicate primarily, but also how to give instructions and also to kind of solve problems as well. It's really interesting, and I think if I'd been doing just one thing for all that time, my skills may not be quite as diverse or as effective as they are now. So I think it is important to do more than one thing, but as you say, there's a fine line between doing more than one thing and too many, because it starts to become messy otherwise.
For sure. I'm actually curious, because you work with a similar high school, younger age groups, do you find that if you can teach to them, you can teach to anyone?
100%. Yeah. So trying to explain something to a very young youth athlete with no experience, with very poor, I suppose, competencies in terms of movement and just general coordination. If you can find a simple but effective way to convey or communicate to them, you can do it to anyone. And I did it the wrong way round, really. I kind of went from a academy setting to a pro sports setting to an education setting. I think if I'd gone from an education setting to an academy setting to a pro sports setting, would have been a bit more of a smoother transition. But that's more from a selfish point of view.
Yeah.
Even that doesn't, to be honest, doesn't really matter what order the experiences are in. Like, I think if you can definitely work effectively with young athletes with very little experience and very poor physical literacy, then you can work with anyone. And it's not just about what you coach; it's how you coach it. So I feel like communication's also like a huge part of it too, because as we all know, quite a lot of pro athletes are like children.
Yeah.
And if you can communicate to children properly, you can communicate really effectively to pro athletes. Obviously, not all of them are that bad, but there are some certain sports which make it harder than others. But yeah, I kind of agree with where you're coming from there.
Yeah, and I find when you bring back the fun and the engagement, like you have to at the younger level, that the older athletes and more experienced ones love it, because it's bringing them back to not just, monotonous business every day. Even the language, they love it.
I found that quite a lot of my speed and power, but definitely conditioning drills these days are all game based, no matter who it's with.
Nice.
Just because it's fun, and if it's fun, people want to do it. And then if you make it a little bit more competitive, the intensity goes up more, probably more than it would if it was done as just a kind of standard drill or a standard exercise. Making it fun, which makes it more competitive, which then in turn makes it more intense without them really realising it, is something that I've learnt from having that experience with young athletes and working with more than one sport. So I suppose just varying your experiences and varying the challenges that you put yourself under can definitely make you look at things from a better point of view with more of a diverse toolbox in your bag, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one for sure.
So, Chris, I'm going to ask you the question I'm sure you've probably answered over 100 times. For those listeners who aren't quite familiar with what push is and what it does, could you just give us a brief overview and insight to what the technology is and how it can help?
Yeah, so originally it was a wearable device you would wear on your forearm that would measure velocity and power in the weight room. So velocity-based training is something that it's a buzzword these days, but it's been around forever. If you want to talk, the West Side documentary is out right now. Louis Simmons' dynamic effort method has been around for decades. Before that, Eastern Bloc and Russian methods. Everyone has always trained speed and power, but with technology these days, you now have an accessible, affordable means to quantify it. The next iteration of it was now you can put it on a waist belt and do all your jump testing, similar to a OptiJump or a Vertec or some of those tools. And then now you can put it on a barbell, so it functions just like a linear position transducer. So the easiest way to explain it is that I like to think of it as a pocket lab in the weight room. It's a device that fits in your pocket, but the size of a credit card, maybe a little thicker. And you can put it in various formats to measure mainly speed and power, but you can get other metrics like work and force. And if you want to deep dive into some more science stuff, you can go there. Connects to an app. App is downloadable. And then there's back-end software, which is actually what I was most intrigued about when I started with them. Having been an Excel monkey for a long time and typing in numbers, I figured there's got to be a better way where all this stuff's automatic. So my focus has been building this back-end software that can do your programming. Any data you collect automatically gets shut up. You can do all your testing from it, do easy reports. Basically all those non-contact hours that are required for programming and reporting, it makes those as simple and fast as possible, which is the goal. So then you can spend more time coaching.
I completely love it, and I feel that since I've used it, it's just given me so much more time to spend doing other things, which is predominantly building the relationships with athletes and also freeing up time that I would be otherwise spent like analysing and reporting data, making programs. It just gives me so much more freedom and flexibility to actually coach, which I think everyone wants. Time is a very precious commodity these days, but especially when you're looking after large groups, it really does help kind of make things a lot more efficient. And I feel that the other thing I've found more than anything is those younger athletes or the slightly more resistant older athletes, which may feel that they've seen it all and done it all. It does create a lot of buy-in. It's a conversation starter, and I found that to be very useful too. And also, as we both know, that working with athletes from a more of an extreme sports, action sports background, they're wired slightly differently. You know, their personalities are differently. The way they go about things is different. I do find that having a tool which measures, you know, speed and power, or maximal intent, and that they can get instant feedback from, does kind of like rev their engine a bit, because it's the kind of thing that they like to do. So I've personally had some great experiences with it, and I think it's brilliant, and it really does solve a lot of problems which, you know, were once presented. With regards to the portal, Chris, I heard or possibly read a while ago you mentioned that there's a certain amount of reps that have been collected over the time span of the product kind of being available and being on the market. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we're up to over 20 million at this point, which to my knowledge would be the largest data set of reps collected through this type of motion data. I'm not sure the exact number because it grows exponentially, but somewhere I know for sure we surpassed 19 million, and I think we might have gone over 20.
What is that data most useful for you guys at Push? How does that help you with the product?
Well, we're using that data to drive a lot of our motion algorithm models. So you can find the average use cases and then the outliers. And what this is helping us create a model that perhaps can guide an athlete even more, so it can start to make suggestions. You know, we had a feature called Push Assist that was very similar, but it just was a little too early at the time. So we're using all this data to drive that. Now, we haven't really dove into our big data questions and analysis yet, but the types of things we could answer is, you know, if you dive into the velocity literature, aside from the big three lifts and maybe a prone row and a pull-up, there isn't much data on load velocity profiles for a number of lifts. And we could easily pull from our data and start to create these profiles for different exercises, start to look at different questions to answer from a data set like this.
Yeah.
And we've just started going down the path of thinking about it. So it's definitely something that's on the horizon for us at Push.
Yeah, very exciting. Well, watch your space with these potential new additional developments with the band. It's all very exciting. So I just wanted to kind of just change direction really of the conversation, because I'm sure you get asked a lot about that. So I didn't want to oversaturate all of the things I wanted to talk to you about, just focusing on one thing. With regards to your career so far, obviously you've had a lot of different experiences in different areas. And you've got a lot of different expertise in different areas. What would you say now, with the things that you do daily, what are your kind of top 3 areas of interest at the moment?
That's interesting, because I've kind of taken a completely different approach to working with freestyle ski. You know, I used to be into the hardcore science, measure numbers, get all this super detailed information, and I'm taking a much more qualitative approach.
Yeah.
Creating a culture and an environment where they want to be in the gym with me every day. And even if I'm not there, they want to be in the gym on their own. And as you know, in those type of sports, they can be very successful without strength conditioning. A lot of it's skill-based. And historically, a lot of them wouldn't have gotten into strength conditioning until they've gotten hurt and had to rehab. So kind of getting that culture and that buy-in started from a very young age is something that really intrigues me, which is a people game. It's not so much about, what force plate numbers or this or that. It's, do you want to show up to this environment and do some work with me every day? And what can I do to facilitate that? So that's one thing that definitely intrigues me. Now, in contrast, working with push, making measurement of movement and sport performance as simple, affordable, and actionable as possible. I did my grad work in quantitative biomechanics. I went down this biomechanics rabbit hole of computing joint torques and squats and lunges and doing inverse dynamics and all this stuff. But then coming back to the real world, it's, well, how do I use this $250,000 biomechanics lab on a daily basis in the gym? And the answer is you don't. So how do we make this stuff very digestible and actionable? And that's why I love working with push. I'd say one other piece that really interests me is concurrent training. I'd say the other aspect aside from the action acrobatic extreme sports is I've always worked with endurance athletes. And I think it's an area that strength conditioning still hasn't even come close to its potential, although it is becoming more popular. And it was Olympic canoe kayak that kind of got me into this, which is, it's a bit of a lifestyle surf sport. There's no collegiate, there's no pro, there's no money. But it's this grueling endurance sport that lives this kind of beach culture lifestyle. And so I went down this rabbit hole of how do we maximize strength and power in an endurance sport where the volume is really high. And so I've gone down this rabbit hole of building a model for the last 10 years in strength training for endurance athletes. So I'd say that's another one that I don't talk about much that really intrigues me on the back end.
Yeah. Awesome. I know we spoke, it was probably nearly a year ago, maybe a bit less than that, about models and systems and processes, because I showed you some of the stuff I've gone through or kind of created, and having a model or having a template with I suppose some direction on it, for me, like, makes it very much easier to coach in a very progressive way or regressive way, depending on what needs to be done. Do you feel like having your own model, your own systems, your own processes, which can kind of guide you or guide an athlete in a certain direction, is important, or do you feel that it's something that you don't really tend to use?
I think it's very important. When young students in this industry, young practitioners come to me, that's one of the first things I say is, depending on their goals, because I do think the industry has changed and people do need to find a niche sooner than later.
Yeah.
Maybe aside from teenage levels, I think the days of the generalist is kind of gone, just because there's so much supply. There's so many coaches, and it's a battle to get a job these days. And creating a model for your niche is something that it's lifelong. You're always going to iterate on it, but it's a guiding light, and it gives you something to go back to. This is my model. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. I'm going to tweak the model. And I guess how I kind of came around to this was when I got inserted into the Canadian Olympic canoe kayak team. It's a sport that has a rich history in Canada, dating back to our native culture. But even on the racing side, one of the athletes I worked with, Mark Oldershaw, who's still competing, his father, Scott Oldershaw, was the national team coach, and their grandfather, Bert Oldershaw, was an Olympian way back in the day. So we have all this history of what has been done and what has been done well. And in the Montreal Olympics, I think it was 76, a lot of the Eastern Bloc athletes defected to Canada and never left because of what was going on over there at the time. And so we have all this injection of Hungarian physiology and paddle culture, and Polish and Serbian and Russian. And so it was a sport that had all these different models. And instead of me going in and telling them what to do, what I did is, you know what? Let's just keep going with your model. I'm going to observe it for a year. I'm going to dig into the science to validate the things you're doing. And I'm going to find the gaps that I can potentially fill in instead of trying to change this model that has 50, 60, 70 years of history, experience, and empiricism behind it.
Yeah.
And like your model, I love what you've put together. I think it's extremely detailed yet extremely simple to follow. I think that's one of the things why you and I kept chatting, and great minds think alike, or at least similar minds think alike. I don't know how great we are, but I definitely identify with a lot of the things you do, and I think your model's awesome.
Sweet. No, thanks very much, mate. It's very kind of you to say. I mean, to be honest, as I said before, it's just basically like 12 years of coaching lots of different sports and lots of different athletes in some form of, I suppose, chaos management order. Yeah. So, always having some form of starting point and then, a direction to regress or progress depending on where they need to go. Because they always kind of know where they want to go, but it's not necessarily where they need to go. So having that to help guide them and maybe kind of push them when they need to be pushed and rein them in when they need to be reined in is very useful. But as you rightly said, right now I'm probably working with 15 different sports on a daily basis or weekly basis. There's so many different, I suppose, historical methods, systems and processes of how to do things specific to that sport, and there's so many coaches that I kind of communicate and work with every day who've had so much experience of that. So I did exactly what you did. When I first kind of started out with these sports, I just kind of was a fly on the wall and said, look, do you mind if I just watch and see what you do? And they were like, well, don't you want to change anything? I said, well, not yet. I just want to see what you're doing. Because I think it would have been, a bit naive or foolish to just go and change something that you didn't really know if it needed to be changed or why they were doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
I do think a lot of people or a lot of organisations feel they need to justify their presence or existence by making change immediately, when that's not actually what they're being employed to do. They're being employed to help maximise the opportunity of that athlete to either perform at the highest level or reduce their likelihood of being injured, but ultimately play that sport or be able to participate and train in that sport or be available for selection for as long as possible. And just by kind of taking a step back and observing first or at regular periods of time, I think is a much more effective way of doing it than just going all in and trying to make change just because. I've made that mistake before in the past, but it's something now that I'm very, very aware of. So I completely agree with you on that one. So just moving on, Chris, with all of the things you've done, what would you say the most valuable lessons you've learned are?
That's an interesting one. I think the biggest thing that all my mentors kind of imparted on me, and I don't know if it's groupthink or the way I selected them, but it's not about you, and it dovetails nicely based on what you were just saying. It's not about us as the strength coach. Be very humble and egoless. So many people are hanging on and think everything's secret, and just share as much as you can and learn. It's all been done before, and if you don't think it has, I'm sure we could dig up someone who did it decades ago in a different name, in a different format, in a different language. One of my first mentor, Steve, what he gave to me early on was a USB key that had every piece of programming and work and presentation he had ever done. And that was the first thing he gave to me. He's like, here, this will help you. So be humble, be egoless. This isn't about us. This is about the athletes and the coaches and the sport. And it's funny, in all my experiences dealing with administrations, I have to bring this up a lot. Without us, they're still playing their game. They're still competing. They're still training. without them, we don't have a job.
Yeah.
So we're dependent on them. So don't make it about you. I would say another one would be don't let your education get in the way of your learning. I think education has become such a competition because of the saturation of people to jobs, the supply and demand, that, you know, when I got into it, you didn't need a master's. Now you need a master's, and we're starting to see people get PhDs to be strength coaches, which is just interesting in general. But there's so much learning. This is a people game. This is in the trenches. You have to spend time in the trenches. Go spend time with other coaches in the trenches. That's where the best learning is going to happen. You know, I didn't have the privilege of being a high-level athlete who competed. So I got into the coaching side pretty early and was spending all my time in the trenches learning from coaches at that level. And I think it's a people game first.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I was speaking to one of my previous guests a few weeks ago about this, and I set up a partnership with the school I work with and the local university that offer a sports science and strength and conditioning undergrad and master's degree, and we have kind of set up the opportunity for some of those undergraduates to come in and be in my environment with the athletes that I work with, and basically just kind of get their hands dirty and learn and practice coaching, which I never had when I was at university. And I just feel like it's very important to get that real world experience as quickly as possible, because it's really easy to live in a bubble and to watch people coaching on Instagram every day, but unless you actually do it and practice it and make the mistakes and have those difficult conversations and have to be put on the spot, you're not going to learn. And I feel that the point where I'm going with this, I told you I'll go off at tangents, was the first thing I've got on like my list of things that I want them to kind of experience and to learn about are how to communicate properly and how to build relationships. And they read it and go, well, what's this got to do with strength and conditioning? I said, well, when they ask me that, I just think you really need to be here because if you don't know that, then you really are going to struggle. And then just coming back to what you said, I think there are a lot of things that you have to know about science and biomechanics and physiology and nutrition and everything as an S&C coach, but you need to be able to effectively communicate and build relationships before you can do anything else. And that's probably the thing I found I learned latest over anything else, which I wish I knew first.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you there, mate. I know that you were on a roll. I just feel that I had to allude to that point.
No, it's awesome, and it makes me think of two more things that I'd love to touch on. Is one simple line I tell all the students and people I mentor is, and it's not my line, it's been said a million times, but they don't care what you know until they know that you care. And so my number one goal as a coach is to build trust. You know, there's very few environments that I think the whole militaristic dominating style works. I think there are a few that it is decently suited for, but that's not my style. And in the Olympic world, and definitely in the acrobatic action sport world, that it's all about trust, because these people put their life on the line for sport, and they want to know that you have their best interest at heart. And in my opinion, you can't achieve great things until that trust is there.
Sure.
And the second thing you said was mistakes. You know, you have the young students practicing early to make mistakes. That's the key, is creating an environment where you can make mistakes with low consequence to make sure that those mistakes don't happen during the game when it's high consequence.
Sure.
Or leading up to a Olympic preparation because you've been building up for 4 years. You want to make all your mistakes early in the quad. You don't want them to happen, you know, during the big show. So no, I love the tangent. I agree with everything that you're saying.
I think that if you're too conservative all the time, then you put yourself at risk by not delivering to your full potential, or opening up the risk of something. If something's not gone slightly wrong before, ever, it's very likely it could go very wrong in the future. So I think it's just trying to balance out that risk factor, but also kind of eliminating that naivety of something is probably going to, something negative is going to happen, whether I can control it or not. Let's just be ready for it and be able to react to it, rather than just let it happen and not know what to do. Yeah. And especially with, as you say, with the sports that we work in, like I've spent a lot of time a couple of years ago working with some sprint BMXers, and my biggest challenge was, what can they actually do when they come to me in the gym, because they're always injured. Like that was my main, the main thing on my list was, right, okay, so what does today bring? How many more injuries are they going to have, and it's not what can they do, rather what can they not do, and how can I help them get better when they walk out? That was really difficult, and I think that is one of the other big challenges working with action sports and extreme sports is that as well. You have to sometimes think kind of inside the box rather than outside the box, because everything and anything can happen at any time.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Steve has been one of your influences. Are there any others, Chris, that you, or any other people that you've kind of met in your career who've really helped you shape your understandings and kind of guide you to a positive direction with things?
Yeah, I've had three major mentors, Steve Lidstone being the first, and then I touched on Chris Dawson.
Yeah.
So Chris, he's a legend, but he's so humble. Nobody knows who this guy is, and he'd probably be giving me shit right now if he knew I was telling his story. But he was a physiologist with numerous NHL teams way back in the day. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't any Olympian from the Toronto area or Ontario he touched across any sport. And he was just a brilliant physiologist and strength coach that, he always had time for me, no matter what question, anything. He would just give me time, which, as we discussed, is an insanely valuable asset. And I learned so much from him on, like you said, on how to be around athletes, how to coach, how to interact, and how to run testing, how to do lab, like just endless. He was definitely the biggest influence during my time at the Sport Institute. And then the third one would be my grad school supervisor, Tyson Beach. So I took a course called Resistance Training Specialist in North America. It's kind of an engineer's statics approach to strength conditioning, but it's heavily rooted in physics. And I had this aha moment, and I started finding all the answers to my questions in physics, biomechanics. And so I'd say the influence there would be Newtonian mechanics. For all intents and purposes, humans are mass-based that don't move at the speed of light, so the rules hold true 100% of the time. But it was Tyson who I ended up doing grad school under, and went down this rabbit hole of how do we actually measure movement? Because we coach it, we talk about it, we assess it with our eyes, but how do we measure it? And that can really help you understand what you can and can't talk about and infer and assume in the weight room. So he was a massive influence, a biomechanist that understands strength conditioning and movement. And this whole concept of movement as a behavior. So in the gym, we're trying to shape behavior and movement and these key features of movement, and how do we stabilize them and perturb them, and the nexus of motor learning and biomechanics, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Awesome. Love that. I find that there's a lot more emphasis now, and especially in master's degrees with sports performance or strength and conditioning, there's a lot more emphasis on biomechanics. And then within that kind of, I suppose, area, there's a lot more emphasis on physics and just basic mathematics as well, because it's been around for so long. It's still ultimately a science. It's still going to have a lot of use in these, day-to-day environments, and I think it's easy for people to just to think slightly shallower than just sets and reps, when there is sometimes a lot more to it, but from a completely different context.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just resistance is just physics applied. It's force. I mean, it's all biomechanics. So I I love it, and I try to push students in that direction. I find the motor learning fascinating too, because that's the skill acquisition piece. But the two go pretty hand in hand. I mean, we can't unmarry the physiology and all the other stuff. That's why it's a movement system. But I think if you're going to be reductionistic, start with the biomechanics. I think that's the best place to start.
Sure. So this alludes quite nicely to what you've just been speaking about. If there's something that you needed to find out about, if you needed to get information about something that you weren't really sure of, what would be your kind of go-to places to find it?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, with today's age, we have so much access to information.
Yeah.
At my science side, I'll go to a lit review. PubMed, Google Scholar, hit all the databases and see what I can dig up. I'll call the person. So if I know there's someone that has knowledge in this area, I would get on the horn with them. I think that's something that people today, it's a long lost art, for lack of a better term.
Sure.
Is picking up the phone and actually have a conversation, because people really appreciate it. It's very personal, and experts want to share their knowledge for the most part. So that'd be a big one. I find it hard to stay on top of books these days because there's so many and they're being put out at a rapid rate.
Yeah.
And then I try to stick to my wheelhouses. Like, I don't try to know everything about everything. I try to stick to the few areas of my focus and what I enjoy and what I'm trying to be good at. You can't be great at everything. So pick a few niches and deep dive in them and become really good at those, and know enough of the other stuff to get by and to not make massive mistakes.
I completely agree. I think when I speak to a lot of people who, when I in passing having conversations with people which I try and help out who are trying to get into the field, and they say, what's the secret? I said, well, there isn't really a secret, but if I could say one thing, it would be kind of a specialist generalist rather than a general specialist. Because if you can know a little bit about a lot, you're going to probably be able to do more with it, rather than know a lot about a little bit. If that makes sense, you're probably going to get a bit stuck. I've always find that there's, especially in the UK, there's a lot of S&Cs who are big S and small C, whereas they're very happy in a gym environment. But as soon as it becomes to movement and speed and conditioning based drills outside the gym, you're not very comfortable. I've made that mistake when I kind of first got into the industry, but I'd probably say now it's probably gone the other way. It's probably like a smaller S and a bigger C, but I suppose you ultimately want to have an evenness of both, I think. And if you don't, then exactly as you just said, you go and ask someone who knows more about it than you do, and to see if they can share some knowledge and information that you may not have. I think there's nothing wrong with asking, is there? I feel that, as you said, is something people for some reason don't want to do or know how to do as well as they should. Just going to wrap up with a couple of more questions because I promised to keep you for an hour. So you're predominantly working with freestyle skiers more as your main athlete group at the moment, is that right?
Yeah, one of the two. Skiers and paddlers.
Cool. All right. Brilliant. So if you could choose like the top sports performance exercises or drills that you're kind of doing with them at the moment, can you just give us some examples of them? What the ones that you probably do more than others on a day-to-day basis at the moment?
Their biggest risk area is landing.
Okay.
They're going off gigantic jumps, tons of air time, spinning in a bunch of directions, they will crash. So teaching them to land with high force, with high speed, in a bunch of different ways, building a robustness there in an environment that's a lot less risky than on snow. So lots of varied landing and force absorption, eccentrics, isometrics, high loading. Then I would say, interestingly enough, a robustness similar to handle crashes, but let's say it's more on a rail where you're going to land on your side. You know, a lot of athletes will separate their shoulders. So doing some upper body hypertrophy and just getting strong up top is something that helps them in the worst case scenario. And in their case, we're always training for the worst case scenario, because if things go well, then, you know, they're going to be fine. And then the third, I'd say, which is heavily influenced by my mentor's mentor, so a gentleman by the name of Scott Livingston, is a lot of hip dissociation and control work. So can they control their body around a single leg stance? You know, because if things go wrong, you're off balance on a single ski. And can you keep that leg aligned no matter what position your body's in? Because if a skier gets an ACL or a fracture or something really bad, you know, they're out for a year at least.
Yeah. Realistically.
So anything that allows them to prevent that knee from going with the ski or in any direction they don't want it, which to me, I love hip dissociation work. And it's kind of, if you've never heard it before, it's hard to tell without visualizations, but controlling your full body around that femur, moving the acetabulum around the head of the femur, controlling your body with various speeds and loads.
Awesome. Love that. That links quite nicely to what I would call my dynamic strength progressions. I'm not sure if I showed you those, but basically having those simple movement categories, but with added areas of challenge, so starting in different positions, landing in different positions, adding on different, I suppose, momentum challenges during the actual movement and at the start and the end as well, with uneven weights or bands, and making sure they can do it on both sides. Sounds silly, but sometimes doing it with their eyes closed. Because a lot of the guys I work with, obviously, when they're upside down or spinning, they close their eyes. They find it easier to kind of feel the movement, right, and then spot the landing at the end rather than have their eyes open for the whole thing. So yeah, I think that's quality, really cool, and it makes lots of sense, especially when they are going as high and as fast as I've seen your guys go. It's pretty crazy. So, Chris, last question. What would you say your top pieces of advice would be for the younger you in kind of life, exercise, and or sport science?
Oh, that's a tough one. Hindsight's 20/20. I would say this is an interesting industry, and I have a passion for it, and it's probably that passion that has been part of the reason where I am, but it hasn't come at a cost. So whether that's friendships, relationships, you know, there's a lot of time and effort put in. You don't really get to leave your work at work a lot of the time. So just knowing these things, and I guess a younger me or someone who's coming up, I would say, if this is what you really want to do, here is what it's like. And if you want the 9 to 5 where you leave your work at work, you know, maybe trades are a better option, or just getting them to think around that, because I find it's a career that, because maybe it's just me, I have such a passion, my brain never shuts off. So find your why. Why are you doing this career? Make sure it's for the right reasons. You know, we all see on social media the salaries and the whole everyone complaining about it, but that's just the nature of supply and demand. So if you're in this industry for the money, you've picked the wrong industry. And so I would say really thinking about those things and what you value. And then, a few of the things I did right, I'd say I got into what I wanted to and the sports I wanted to. I might even try and get into them a little earlier. I spend all my free time mountain biking, paddling, and skiing. I spend most of my time working with two of those sports, but I'd be doing that even if I wasn't working with those athletes. So try and get to the sports you love. I think there's super high value in learning sports you know nothing about. Like when I started with trampoline, I had zero clue that was even a sport. And you learn a lot by being put into, I spent 6 years with Ice Hockey Canada. I'm not an ice hockey player. I don't fit in a locker room, but the lessons I learned were amazing. But getting to the sports where you're part of that culture, I think just accelerates so much.
Yeah. Learning,
growth, experience, opportunity. So I might even tell myself to try and get into those a little earlier. That's a tough question, man. I think we could spend an hour talking about that, what we would tell our younger selves.
I know. People always say that. That's why I put it at the end. I just feel that sometimes it's really helpful if there's just one thing someone can say which can maybe avoid someone else stepping into that pothole.
Yep.
Or stepping into one that's slightly smaller. It's a valuable shared experience or a valuable shared advice. But no, I think you're spot on. I completely agree with that. You can only really excel at something that you truly believe in and you truly are passionate about. And if you can surround yourself in that environment as much as possible, it's going to make sense, isn't it?
100%. Man.
So Chris, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm really, really glad we've got you on the show. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, email chris@trainwithpush.com, Twitter and Instagram @ChappyStrength. Most people call me Chaps or Chappy by my last name, or Chappers. And too many Chris's in the world, so Chappy Strength. Just look that up and you'll be able to find me.
Wicked. Well, look, best of luck with everything you've got coming up, mate. I hope it all goes well.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me. Any opportunity to talk shop, and I love sharing and connecting with you. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to the 20th episode. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please leave us a rating and or review on whichever platform you're listening on. Please check out our website, www.extremesportsperformance.com. On our media page, we have weekly blogs that include Thought of the Week, Exercise of the Week, Recipe of the Week, and Training Song of the Week. Each month's collection gets compiled into our monthly newsletter along with company service and store updates. You can sign up for free to receive this via our subscribe page. Our online store consists of training programs, online and in-person coaching, nutrition plans, toolbox, and interactive training systems. Please follow us on our social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Links to these can be found at the bottom of every page on our website or via any search engine. That's all for now. Until next time, take care.